I think it's very entertaining. I do. But I love music. I love to hear the voice.
She had a voice that didn't just sing. It soared. It bent steel and broke hearts, carried Sunday morning gospel into Saturday night arenas, turned silence into thunder. Whitney Houston was more than a singer. She was a storm, a prayer, a fire too bright to be contained. And yet, for all her light, the world demanded more. More songs, more glamour, more perfection, until the same voice that once lifted her became the very chain that pulled her under. We think we know Whitney's story.
First of all, let's get one thing straight. Crack is cheap. I make too much money to ever smoke crack. Let's get that straight, okay?
The fairy tale rise, the record-breaking charts, the glossy music videos that made her America's sweetheart. But behind the fame, there was a darker truth. One of loneliness, control, and a desperate fight to be heard as a woman, not just a product. Because Whitney wasn't simply born into stardom, she was shaped by the church choir, sharpened by a mother's ambition, and burdened by an industry that wanted her voice but not her full truth. She was caught between gospel and pop, between the black church that raised her and the crossover markets that consumed her. She was both the dream and the warning, the sound of America's promise, and its most painful betrayals. Her story isn't just about music. It's about race, gender, addiction, and the impossible standards placed on a black woman with the greatest voice of her generation. It's about the toll of carrying a gift so heavy it becomes a curse. And though the tabloids told one story, the decline, the scandals, the tragedy, the truth is deeper. Whitney's music still lives, sampled in hip-hop beats, belted out by new divas, remembered every time "I Will Always Love You" sends chills through the room. This story matters because it forces us to ask, what do we demand of our icons? What do we take from them, and what do we leave behind? Whitney Houston gave everything. And in the end, the world wasn't ready to hold the weight of what she carried. Tonight, we're telling the story they tried to silence. Chapter 1. The Choir and the Chains. Before the stadiums, before the magazine covers, before the world crowned her the voice, Whitney Houston was just a little girl in Newark, New Jersey, raised in the arms of gospel. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was no ordinary mom. She was a powerhouse singer in her own right, backup for Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley, leader of the Sweet Inspirations. From the start, Whitney's lullabies weren't nursery rhymes. They were rehearsals. They were lessons in pitch, power, and poise. Picture it, a small girl in the pews of New Hope Baptist Church, the air thick with organ smoke and sweat-soaked Sunday best. She's shy, but when she opens her mouth, the congregation goes still. The sound is pure, otherworldly, like a trumpet and a whisper all at once. The pastor says it's a gift from God. But gifts in the Houston family came with responsibility. Whitney learned early. Her voice wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the church, to the family, to the dream of breaking free from Newark's struggles. And as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, riots tearing through Newark, civil rights battles raging, heroin flooding black communities, her family pinned its hopes on her. She wasn't just singing. She was carrying the weight of survival. By her teens, she was already performing with her mother in nightclubs, smoky rooms where gospel met grit and innocence rubbed up against the edges of the industry. These were places a child had no business being. Yet Whitney's mother insisted it was training. The church gave her discipline, but the clubs gave her armor. Still, Whitney's heart belonged to the choir. She once said, "Singing in church, that's where you learn honesty. You can't fool a church crowd." But honesty would become harder to hold on to once the record men came calling. Because here's the truth. Whitney's rise didn't begin with freedom. It began with chains. Chains of expectation, chains of image, chains forged in both the church pews and the record contracts waiting in the shadows. And so, the little girl with the heavenly voice stepped out of the choir loft and into the fire. Next came the offers, the deals, the shaping of an image that would catapult her to glory and lock her into a role she could never escape. Chapter 2. The making of an idol. By the late 1970s, Whitney wasn't just a preacher's daughter anymore. She was tall, radiant, with a face made for the spotlight and a voice built for eternity. Newark's church pews had given her soul, but New York's runways would give her something else: visibility. At just 16, Whitney stepped into the world of modeling, gracing the pages of 17 and Glamour. She was one of the first black women to appear on a 17 cover, a small revolution tucked inside glossy pages. America was beginning to flirt with diversity, but always in ways it could package, soften, and sell. Whitney's beauty was undeniable, her smile disarming, her presence magnetic. To the outside world, she was a dream. But inside, she knew the truth. It wasn't her face they wanted. It was a way to make her voice more palatable to the mainstream. That voice had already begun to draw industry eyes. By the early 80s, whispers traveled through the clubs of Manhattan. There's a girl who can outsing them all. Record labels hovered like hawks. But it was one man who would define her trajectory: Clive Davis. Clive didn't just see Whitney. He heard her. He heard not just gospel or soul, but crossover potential. He believed he could mold her into the ultimate star, someone who could dominate both R&B and pop, someone who could break barriers while staying carefully in bounds. To many, Clive Davis was the kingmaker. To Whitney, he was the architect of her destiny. The plan was simple: polish her, repackage her, make her universal. She wasn't to be boxed in by the church, by black radio, or by the rough edges of soul. No, Whitney would be presented as pristine, angelic, America's sweetheart with a halo in her voice. And so, the transformation began. The smoky clubs were replaced by pristine studios. The natural grit of gospel was rounded off, reshaped into melodies that could soar across radio formats. In 1985, the world would hear the result. Whitney Houston, her debut album, shimmering with power ballads and crossover anthems. It was clean. It was triumphant. It was undeniable. But under the shine, something was already cracking. Some in the black community whispered she was being packaged for white America, her sound too polished, her image too safe. In the very moment the world embraced her, her own people began to ask, had she been taken from them? It was the paradox of her career. The higher she rose, the more divided the love became. And as the hits piled up, so too did the expectations and the silent toll they would take, because glory, for Whitney, always came with a shadow. All right, let's step into Whitney's golden era, where the light of fame began to cast its longest shadows. Chapter 3, Velvet Shadows. By the mid-1980s, Whitney Houston was untouchable. Her debut album stormed the charts, birthing hits like Saving All My Love for You and How Will I Know. Radio couldn't resist her. MTV, once hesitant to showcase black artists, suddenly couldn't get enough of her radiant smile and effortless voice. By her second album, simply titled Whitney, she shattered records, the first woman to debut at #1 on the Billboard chart. She was a phenomenon. America crowned her the Voice, a voice that could leap octaves, break hearts, and bring even skeptics to tears. She was polished, perfect, a dream carefully sculpted for the world stage. She became a symbol of crossover success, proof that soul could be universal, proof that a black woman could rule the pop charts with elegance and grace. But here's the thing about perfection: it's a mask, and masks grow heavy. Behind the glamour, Whitney felt the sting of whispers. At award shows, she was sometimes booed by black audiences who felt she had been packaged too neatly for white America. They accused her of abandoning her roots, of trading grit for gloss. At the 1989 Soul Train Awards, the boos rained down when her name was called. She smiled through it, but the wound cut deep. Whitney later said, "They called me Whitey. That hurt more than anything." This was the paradox of her fame, adored by millions, yet questioned by her own community. Her voice was celebrated as universal, but her identity was under siege. She wasn't just singing anymore. She was caught in the crossfire of what black success was supposed to look and sound like. Loneliness became her shadow. The stage was packed. The awards lined her shelves, but the woman behind the legend was often isolated. Friends and insiders described her as playful, mischievous, hungry for real connection. But her life was carefully managed, her image fiercely protected. Every smile, every note, every public appearance was scrutinized. In those velvet shadows, Whitney longed for authenticity, for the church choirs, for freedom, for someone who would see the girl beneath the crown. And soon, she would find that person, a man whose fire matched her own, a love story that promised freedom, passion, and truth, but instead delivered storms. Because just as Whitney stood at the pinnacle of glory, she opened the door to the love that would become both her sanctuary and her undoing. Chapter 4, Fire and Fury. When Whitney Houston met Bobby Brown, sparks ignited, the kind of sparks that don't just glow, they burn. He was the bad boy of New Edition, already infamous for his swagger, his street edge, his unpredictability. She was America's golden girl, polished to perfection, the angelic voice. On paper, they were opposites. In reality, they recognized each other's fire instantly. Their love story wasn't a slow flame. It was a lightning strike. They married in 1992, a lavish ceremony that looked like a fairy tale but felt behind the scenes like a storm gathering. To the public, Whitney was supposed to choose a polished partner, someone who upheld her carefully cultivated image. Instead, she chose Bobby, raw, defiant, unpredictable. And that choice was her rebellion. For years, Whitney had been accused of being too polished, too whitewashed, too safe. But Bobby was her answer to the critics, her way of saying, I am still Newark, I am still the church in the street, I am not your doll, your perfect angel. With Bobby, she claimed a part of herself that had been denied by the industry machine. But rebellion has a cost. Their marriage was passionate but volatile. Love mixed with jealousy, devotion tangled with destruction. Bobby resented being overshadowed by Whitney's fame, while Whitney defended their bond fiercely against tabloids, friends, even family. The world saw chaos, arrests, shouting matches, rumors of abuse. But Whitney saw love, loyalty, a partner who let her drop the mask and be real. It was also during this period that drugs became more than whispers. The industry had long tolerated the shadows of cocaine and crack in the entertainment world. But for Whitney, the substances were both an escape and a trap. Together, she and Bobby spiraled deeper into habits that blurred the line between passion and poison. And yet, in the middle of the storm, Whitney's star reached its peak. In 1992, she starred in The Bodyguard. The film made her a global icon, and the soundtrack became one of the best-selling albums of all time. Her rendition of I Will Always Love You wasn't just a song. It was an anthem, a force of nature, a cultural moment that froze the world in awe. The contradiction was staggering. On stage, she was untouchable, the greatest voice of her generation. Off stage, she was fighting for her sanity, her marriage, her life. The cracks were showing, but the world didn't see them yet. Because when you're the voice, the show must go on. Chapter 5. Cracks in the Crown. The 1990s should have been Whitney's decade of triumph. After The Bodyguard, she was more than a superstar. She was an institution. Her voice was the soundtrack of weddings, graduations, funerals, Olympic ceremonies. She could step on stage, sing one note, and command the entire world's attention. But crowns are heavy, and Whitney's began to crack. The tabloids, once charmed by her perfection, started circling. Stories of missed rehearsals, canceled shows, and a shrinking frame began to dominate the headlines. Fans who once saw her as untouchable now whispered about drugs, about chaos at home, about a star slipping away. Her once flawless performances became unpredictable. At concerts, her golden voice sometimes faltered, strained, or disappeared altogether. Reporters who had crowned her the voice now speculated if she was losing it. But the truth was more complex. Whitney was battling exhaustion, addiction, and the crushing pressure of carrying an image she no longer wanted to wear. Inside the industry, there was frustration. Insiders complained she was late to shows, difficult in rehearsals. But behind the scenes, friends described a woman in pain, torn between the demands of fame and the need to simply be Whitney, not Whitney Houston trademarked. The marriage with Bobby fueled the fire. Public spats, arrests, even a reality show years later that turned their private struggles into national spectacle. What outsiders saw as dysfunction, Whitney often defended as love. She once said, "I'm not anyone's angel. I'm human." But for the world, that honesty didn't fit the myth. And yet, even in decline, her brilliance refused to vanish. In 1998, she released My Love Is Your Love, an album that showed she could still adapt, still captivate. Songs like It's Not Right, But It's Okay spoke with grit and defiance, reflecting both her personal battles and her cultural resonance in an era shifting toward hip-hop and R&B dominance. Still, the cracks widened. The media began to feast on her downfall, turning every missed note, every shaky appearance into headlines. The same press that once polished her into perfection now painted her as tragic spectacle. Whitney once stood as America's sweetheart, untouchable and pure. Now, she was framed as a cautionary tale. The idol was breaking. The voice was faltering. But the story wasn't finished. Because even as the crown slipped, Whitney had one last performance to give, one last battle to fight. Chapter 6, The Fall and the Fight. By the dawn of the 2000s, the whispers about Whitney Houston had turned into shouts. The tabloids no longer painted her as America's sweetheart, but as a fallen angel. The voice, once flawless, crystalline, divine, now trembled under the weight of exhaustion, addiction, and years of relentless pressure. And then came the interview that changed everything. In 2002, Whitney sat across from Diane Sawyer in what was supposed to be a redemption arc. Instead, it became a cultural shockwave. Looking gaunt, jittery, and defensive, Whitney denied the wildest rumors while confirming others. When asked about drug use, she infamously declared, "Crack is whack." The phrase exploded across headlines, comedy sketches, and late-night talk shows. What she intended as defiance became ridicule. The woman who once sang like heaven now found herself mocked like a punchline. Yet beneath the spectacle was a brutal truth. Whitney was drowning. The pressures of fame, the chaos of her marriage, and the lure of drugs had dragged her into a spiral. In interviews, she admitted she had lost herself. "The biggest devil is me," she confessed. "I'm either my best friend or my worst enemy." Still, Whitney was a fighter. She entered rehab multiple times, trying to claw back the life and voice that had once seemed untouchable. Friends and family rallied around her. Fans held on to hope that the woman who gave them greatest love of all could find that love for herself again. But recovery was not a straight line. Public appearances were uneven. Some performances hinted at the old magic. Others revealed the toll the years had taken. Critics were harsh, unforgiving. The industry that once profited off her every note now distanced itself from her decline. And yet, through all the chaos, Whitney never surrendered her spirit. Even when her voice faltered, her presence commanded attention. Even when mocked, she carried herself with flashes of the regal grace that had first stunned the world. The tragedy was not just that Whitney was falling. It was that the world watched with voyeuristic fascination, forgetting that behind the spectacle was a woman, a mother, a daughter still searching for peace. By the mid-2000s, the question lingered, could Whitney rise again? Or was this the final act of a star burning out before our eyes? The answer would come in the most unexpected way, through a comeback that was both triumphant and heartbreaking. Because Whitney wasn't finished singing, not yet. Chapter 7, The Last Song. In 2009, the world held its breath. After years of scandal and silence, Whitney Houston stepped back into the spotlight with a simple, aching declaration, "I look to you." The title track of her comeback album wasn't just a song. It was a confession, a prayer, a plea. Written with the weight of her struggles in mind, it spoke of brokenness and redemption, of leaning on faith when the body is tired and the spirit weary. The album debuted at number 1. Fans rejoiced. Critics, though cautious, admitted the voice, though weathered, still carried a depth that perfection never could. Whitney's instrument had changed. The pristine highs of her youth were gone, but what remained was raw, smoky, etched with scars. In its imperfection, it carried truth. She launched a world tour, eager to prove herself again. The anticipation was electric, but reality was harsher. On stage, Whitney struggled. Audiences who came to hear the angelic notes of old sometimes met a faltering, breathless voice. In Australia, fans booed when she couldn't reach her famous high notes. The headlines were merciless. Yet even in those moments, there were flashes, sudden, radiant glimpses of the woman who had once conquered the world. When she locked eyes with the crowd, when her spirit soared above the strain, Whitney reminded them why they had fallen in love with her. She was no longer a flawless idol. She was human, bruised but unbroken. But the toll was evident. Years of addiction had scarred her voice and her body. The comeback, instead of being a full resurrection, became a bittersweet curtain call. Still, Whitney pressed on. She spoke of faith, of resilience, of finding strength in her daughter, Bobby Christina. She insisted the fight wasn't over, yet behind the brave face, shadows lingered, old habits resurfaced, isolation deepened. Those closest to her described a woman torn between hope and despair, between the will to rise and the pull of old demons. And then, on February 11th, 2012, the world stopped. Whitney Houston was found in a Beverly Hills hotel bathtub, gone at just 48 years old. The night before the Grammys, as the industry prepared to celebrate music's brightest lights, one of its greatest had been extinguished. The news spread like wildfire, shock, grief, disbelief. It felt impossible that the woman who once seemed immortal, whose voice had defined generations, could be silenced. But Whitney's story wasn't just about how she died, it was about how she lived. And what she left behind would echo long after the final note. Chapter 8. The Legacy. Whitney Houston's death was a shock, but her legacy refuses silence. Her voice, that impossible, soaring voice, still carries across time. Every diva who came after her, from Mariah Carey to Beyoncé, traces part of their lineage to Whitney. She set the standard for what a pop ballad could sound like, for how gospel power could live inside mainstream radio. But Whitney's legacy is more than sound. It's the story of what happens when genius collides with the machinery of fame. She showed us the heights, the Grammys, the sold-out arenas, the number ones that seemed to fall like dominoes. And she showed us the cost, the way the industry packages perfection, then punishes imperfection. The way black artists are pushed to be universal but criticized for being too polished. The way women are adored for their voices but rarely protected as human beings. Whitney's life forces us to ask hard questions. What do we demand from our icons? How much of themselves must they give us before we're satisfied? And when they falter, do we show compassion or do we consume their pain as spectacle? Her music lives on in samples and remakes, in hip-hop beats and pop choruses. Songs like I Will Always Love You remain eternal, still able to stop a room, still able to pierce the heart. Greatest Love of All has become an anthem of self-belief, sung by children who weren't even born when Whitney first recorded it. Her national anthem performance at the 1991 Super Bowl is still hailed as one of the greatest live vocal moments in American history. A unifying cry in a time of war and uncertainty. And then there is the human legacy. To her daughter, Bobby Christina, to her fans, to those who saw in her a mirror of both brilliance and vulnerability. Whitney's story is a reminder that even the brightest stars are fragile, that the line between glory and tragedy is razor thin. She was not just the voice. She was a woman. Complicated, flawed, brilliant, and unforgettable. Whitney Houston's echo is not just in her recordings, but in the cultural memory of what she gave us and what was taken from her. She was, and remains, one of the greatest to ever stand before a microphone. And though she is gone, her voice still rises, eternal, defiant, unforgettable. We've walked with Whitney Houston. From the pews of New Hope Baptist Church, where a little girl's voice first stilled a congregation, to the glittering arenas where she commanded the world, to the lonely hotel room where that voice fell silent, her story is not a neat one. It is triumph braided with tragedy, brilliance scarred by burden. She was both the dream and the cautionary tale, the promise of what music can give and the warning of what fame can take away. And yet through it all, she gave us the greatest gift, her voice. That voice that could lift you out of sorrow, make you believe in love, make you feel the hand of something holy. That voice that, even in its decline, carried a raw honesty no perfection could match. Whitney's story is not just hers. It belongs to all of us who have ever asked too much of our heroes, who have consumed their brilliance but turned away from their pain, who have forgotten that the voices that heal us are carried by fragile human bodies. So let me ask you, what's your memory of Whitney? Was it the national anthem that shook a nation? The heartbreaking cry of "I will always love you"? Or a deep cut, a personal favorite that still pulls at you in the quiet hours? Tell us in the comments, because every memory is another way of keeping her alive. And if this story has broken your heart, then prepare yourself for what's next.